Is this week the week? Will there be a reveal in the financial briefing to investors about the state of play of the next Nintendo system? And if not this week, when will the Switch 2 finally be unveiled? Plus, does the small print of an overlooked financial governance report from Nintendo demonstrate that a slow trickle out of information has already begun? Whether the next Nintendo console is months away or even a year or more hence, Nintendo will need to start distributing information sooner or later, and the company has a number of default options it uses, from Nintendo Direct drops to social media announcements to one-off press releases, but they also communicate particularly frequently with their investors. Evidently, the most public-facing example of this is their quarterly investor briefings and Q&A sessions, and these often do contain some terrific insights into how Nintendo are thinking and what their strategies are. However, it's worth noting that the investor Q&A is not the only forum Nintendo has for investor-related discussions. In fact, its recent corporate governance report makes for instructive reading on this front. In the section on dialogue-based IR activities conducted in the 2024 fiscal year, it notes that in addition to a corporate management policy briefing and 3 financial results briefings, the company conducted approximately 400 individual and group meetings with shareholders and investors. If you'd like some specifics of Nintendo's more significant investors and shareholders, I recently covered it in this video on the card at the top of the screen. Nintendo talks in this governance report of actively creating opportunities for dialogue with a broad range of institutional investors, both in Japan and outside of Japan. And they're actually quite specific as to who these people are: fund managers, analysts, environment, social and government or ESG specialists, proxy voting representatives, and others. So far so normal. It's natural for a large and diversified company like Nintendo to take soundings from across the financial and corporate world. However, they do give us an insight into what these specific topics of discussion were in a bullet point entitled Main Dialogue Topics and Matters of Interest to Investors. You can already tell where this is going, can't you? It says, topics covered include financial results overview and business outlook, business momentum of Nintendo Switch, the next game console, and business impact of hardware transition, IP strategy including Nintendo content business, capital policy, ESG, and sustainability initiatives. Let's deal with the last one quickly, as it's kind of natural that if they're meeting specialists in this field, they'll have sustainability-related conversations. But of course, there is a particular benefit at this stage in Nintendo's console lifecycle for them to consider sustainability as they transition to manufacturing a new machine. It's possible to change manufacturing approaches to some degree mid-console cycle, and of course they did this in 2019 when they moved production of the Nintendo Switch out of China and into Vietnam to a large degree, but it's far harder once the form factor of the machine and the supply chains are locked in to make too major a transition. So it's probably a particular focus right now so that Nintendo can ensure they're not just safeguarding the environment, but also safeguarding their reputation by making manufacturing choices that are sustainable. That aside, it's conspicuous here that many of the points given are Switch 2 related or adjacent. Obviously, the business outlook is likely to be dominated in anything outside the short term by the next console. The momentum of the Nintendo Switch is hugely important if they're to continue holding off the successor system, and the business impact of hardware transition will naturally be a concern. However, despite all these conversations, President Shuntaro Furukawa and his board of directors have not yet been bounced into any major public announcements. It's perfectly possible that some of these one-to-one discussions will have been slightly more explicit as to their game plan, but it's also possible that many of these meetings that have been taking place are part of taking the temperature of investors to find a way of creating a strong message and a way of conveying that message that allows them not to say too much too soon. And of course, because these are dialogues, not, well, monologues, it's likely that there is some level of reciprocity. I am sure that speaking to fund managers and other people in the financial world will be helpful for them to navigate some of the difficulties that they might have launching a new console against the backdrop of a tricky financial set of circumstances. Of course, an oft-quoted precedent for an announcement in a financial context is the 3DS announcement in 2010. Here it is on the screen, and you can see that it was not a grand whizzy reveal despite being for such a dramatic and eye-catching hardware change. Note that this was made in a very specific time frame. It was made at the end of March and seems more geared at rallying Nintendo's stock price and profile before the end of the financial year. Is there a chance Nintendo could make a similar move in 2024? Well, I would argue they already did. Their equivalent of this March surprise was Miyamoto's confirmation that a second Super Mario Bros. Movie is now in production. And given that the previous financial year is now over, it's not immediately clear to me that Nintendo needs a new infusion of energy at this time, since the end of the first financial year quarter is not quite such a significant turning point for the company as the end of a financial year. Also bear in mind in 2010, Nintendo were in quite a different situation, particularly because they had been losing significant amounts of money, unprecedented amounts of money, due to the exchange rate between the yen and other currencies at that point. Still, setting aside those issues, is notification of this sort a good idea? Did it work for Nintendo in 2010? Well, with the 3DS, the DS was a 6-year-old console, but it still had a good 2 years of support left in it, and so the announcement of a successor console could easily have been seen to be cutting the legs out from underneath their existing console. But this didn't really happen, and in fact, the DS continued to sell very healthily as the 3DS experienced a rocky start. In my recent video on backwards compatibility, I explored the DS to 3DS transition a little more, but clearly Nintendo was able to maintain momentum of the legacy console for a good period of time, though this was probably at least partly a function of the relatively muted 3DS launch, limiting their ability to move over the customer base. I think the nature of the console also benefited from this very dry, austere announcement. If you're doing something off-the-wall wacky, having a dry and sensible pre-announcement moderates any response and sounds quite reassuring. If you're doing something quite safe and conservative, having a big splashy launch could help jazz it up. The announcement of a 3D console was so eccentric, and the technology remains a little niche, even by today's standards, that taking the sting out of that first announcement allowed for the initial shock of the new idea to die down. Articles could run in the press about the existence of a 3D console and what that could mean, but it would be purely in the field of speculation for the time being. This was effectively their first piece of warm-up marketing for the new system, and at the time they were in the practice of having quite long warm-up cycles to build to new pieces of hardware. Even in 2011, the gaming news infrastructure was not quite so developed as today, and consoles had staggered releases in different regions, so there was less pressure on a single launch date and an internationally agreed message. That said, Nintendo also did this with the Switch back in 2015, announcing the presence of the then called NX console. Again, this was an end of financial year deal, and you can absolutely see why, given how disastrously the Wii U tanked for them, that they would need to rush an announcement to calm investor nerves. At present though, Nintendo is in a very different position. The current console remains successful, even for such a late stage in its lifespan, and to the extent that the rumour mill has produced anything about the next machine, it's suggested to be a more iterative upgrade over the existing model. Now, if the next console transforms into a drone or interfaces directly with the brain, then a dry financial statement warning people that big things are coming down the chute might be exactly what is necessary to let people get used to these strange and new ideas. But prematurely announcing an iterative console doesn't have this benefit or necessity. Now, when I say premature, you may well consider that 7 years and change into the life cycle of the current console is anything but a premature point to announce a successor. But from Nintendo's point of view, premature will mean before they're ready, and there is one aspect of their business where secrecy is going to be of particular benefit to them. Specifically, they are currently going to be making a lot of manufacturing deals with companies for the complex task of creating their new system. Manufacturing has always been a tricky area for Nintendo, as it is for any company, and the new system is likely to have a bigger launch than any they've had previously, or at least for a long time, because it is their only console now, and Switch has opened up the market hugely. An announcement won't end speculation. It will simply ramp up the pressure on Nintendo to announce further information, such as release dates, assuming a release window is not already given. But as soon as you put a release window on your product, you cede advantage in negotiations to the other parties because you're under time pressure to close. Clearly, in any negotiations, Nintendo has a strong arm, being a large company, but they have been burned by other major players previously. Obviously, we know they struggled with chip shortages during the pandemic as Apple and others use their weight, but they've been at a disadvantage for this even prior to 2020. In 2017 and 2018, they had the same issue. The Wall Street Journal reported that despite the success of the early Switch and the strong demand for the console, as they said, the problem was an industry-wide capacity shortage for components used in smartphones, computer servers, and other digital devices. These include NAND flash memory chips that store data, liquid crystal displays, and the tiny motors that enable the Switch's handheld controllers to imitate the feeling of an ice cube shaking in a glass. Just some of the woes that Joy-Con brought to Nintendo during this period. Moreover, at present, many companies are trying to move their manufacturing bases out of China, and Nintendo itself has moved large portions of Switch manufacture to Vietnam. I have another video coming soon that will look at the manufacturing aspects of Nintendo's successor plans, so please subscribe if you're interested in seeing that. But for now, let's just say that there will be considerable competition in the Vietnamese tech space, and it's going to be in Nintendo's best interest to be fleet of foot and flexible until every I is dotted and every T is crossed. Once that happens though, Nintendo will then need to transition to a very different footing. Once the manufacturing schedule is locked in, once all the deals are done, leaks are going to be inevitable, however ruthless the Nintendo ninjas are at rooting them out. Moreover, secrecy becomes less and less desirable. They will need to build relationships with distribution partners and retailers, and that's hard to do with a system that is top secret. As much as I'm sure Nintendo would love to keep its products under wraps for as long as it can to give them maximum flexibility and to preserve focus on the sales of their current system, realistically, that is highly unlikely. Nintendo would far rather be in control of its message than suffering a constant stream of rumours. Another confounding factor is the yen. This channel has talked before about the significant impact that the strength or weakness of the yen could have on the launch of a new system, which requires them to make a massive financial outlay before sales come in. If they're spending big on manufacture and distribution in foreign currencies while the yen is weak, because of the exchange rate they will be paying a steeper price, and that will be fine so long as they are also selling the end result, the final consoles, in the same circumstances. Historically, Nintendo, given the majority of its business takes place overseas, has benefited significantly from the yen being a little weaker against the other currencies. For Nintendo now, launching a system against the backdrop of a volatile foreign exchange market requires some considerable thought, and I'm sure they're drawing extensively on the deep bench of financial expertise they have on their directors board. And actually there is information on Nintendo's website that gives some context to how they have weathered exchange rate fluctuations previously. Nintendo's consolidated statements of income transition are published on their website. Although a rather dry document, the fact that the information given is dating back to the beginning of the 80s, when their video game manufacturing arm was still in its infancy, gives us a particular advantage in that we can see long-term trends. The results are given as a table on their website, but I put their numbers into a graph to make it a little bit more comprehensible. The higher spikes show where foreign exchange rates have been to Nintendo's benefit, and the dips are where they have been to its detriment. These are final figures, so inclusive of any hedging activity. I should also note that inflation is not a factor we need to worry about significantly here, as Japan's history of low inflation cycling with slight deflation over the last 40 years means that the figures given here in millions of yens are broadly of the same value across the period, with only minor wobbles along the way. Looking at this graph closely, you can see the impact of global events, particularly at a couple of times and for a couple of different reasons. In 1995, the radical weakening of the yen was to Nintendo's significant benefit, whereas in 2008, the global financial crisis weakened the global markets abruptly, which was to Nintendo's disadvantage. Of course, we know the problem for Nintendo was compounded at this point by the relatively rapid decline in sales of the Wii towards the middle point of its life, and the failure to secure strong launches for the Wii U and 3DS. If you'd be interested in me deep diving this era of Nintendo in the future, Please let me know in the comments. At present, the situation is relatively strong for Nintendo. The yen is historically weak, and this means foreign sales translate into outsized profits for them. This gives them a certain degree of cover for their financial meetings, as the numbers on paper will not look too bad, even though their cannier investors may see the danger ahead. It is imperative that Nintendo gives a sense of direction, but I don't know that it's imperative that they skip to the end of the page and announce the actual system quite so soon. Other initiatives may come into play here. For example, I noticed an advertisement pop into my email this week from Nintendo promoting a large amount of Amiibo restocks. Clearing old inventory and indeed providing new Amiibo inventory is a great way to leverage the existing large Switch base while pushing them into purchasing Nintendo-related content outside of core games. It's always seemed vaguely inevitable to me that there would one day be an Amiibo game in its own right, and it feels frankly astonishing that this hasn't yet happened, except perhaps for the ill-starred Animal Crossing Amiibo Festival in 2015, which, to be fair, may have spiked the whole thought process for Nintendo for a considerable time. Still, if there were ever a time that a game based on Amiibo requiring people to buy extra merchandise would be very welcome in Nintendo's lineup, it's now, and I'm going to call a 30% forecast that there will be a game utilizing Amiibo as part of its gameplay before the end of 2024. One benefit of Amiibo during this time is that the devices have the capacity to store some data, and this might be a useful extra way of migrating certain information from system to system. The last system launch spotlighted Amiibo to some degree, with Wolf Link in Breath of the Wild being exclusively available to people who had purchased the Wolf Link Amiibo. But Amiibo aren't the only game in town for Nintendo as the year draws to a close. The governance report I quoted from previously also contains a curious statement. It said, "We have been developing new intellectual property." Now, of course, this is always true, and you could say that every new game release is a new piece of intellectual property to some degree. It has been a reasonable time, though, since Nintendo has launched any substantial new property in its own right. They spun off Bayonetta and Princess Peach, and they turned Game Builder Garage into its own concern by recycling gameplay elements included from Nintendo Labo, but I think Ring Fit Adventure may be the last time they've had a very significant title with completely new IP. And if you think about intellectual property that has the benefit of mascot-style characters that could be leveraged into films, theme parks, retail stores, and all the other avenues Nintendo are exploring, you probably have to go back to 2017's ARMS. I'm not saying that Nintendo will unveil a new IP at an investors meeting or even rush to drop one in the new Direct, but if they're hinting at this in financial documents recently, it wouldn't surprise me if this is a headline they're queuing up as a way to distract attention from the current Switch 2 woes. After all, while new IP might feel like a bit of a shrug in the short term for investors, the long-term potential, if one of those properties takes off big time in the way that, for example, Splatoon did, let alone Animal Crossing, is huge. Nintendo has a reasonable case to make that their quietness is simply a sensible maximization of their current position. They're fixing the roof while the sun is shining. My hunch, therefore, is that the message to investors over the coming weeks will be steady as she goes, that they are building intellectual property, pushing initiatives like the new Mario movie, maximizing the potential of the Nintendo Switch with a number of initiatives, some of which may even be trailed during the investor briefing. However, substantive talk of new hardware could be a way off. This channel never claims to call particular outcomes definitively, but rather to assess the broad likelihoods of what will take place. A 30% forecast means that the prediction will come true 30% of the time, but also means that 70% of the time the opposite will happen. And of course, this channel looks to be accountable, so I do go back and review these forecasts periodically. Again, the card at the top of the screen has you covered if you want to see how I make sure I'm broadly on track, but previously though, my 30% forecasts have come off about 33% of the time, so I'm not doing too badly. On this basis, I think there is a 30% chance that Nintendo will announce their new console prior to the end of June 2024. It's possible that they will, prior to this, refer to succession planning being in place, as they have never made it a particular secret that they want to continue with hardware development, but I feel that the balance of probability is that they would rather hold back for the time being anything too specific about what they're doing next, and they have other lines they can take to pacify investors and of course they benefit from the relatively benign exchange rate for their business, which gives them a cushion from having too much sharp criticism. But what about after June? As I've stated, the key to this is when manufacturing ramps up, and for that matter, how long manufacture will take, and at what stage in that process Nintendo will need to start being a lot clearer about their intentions. There are certainly signs recently from third-party accessory developers that this is something that is ramping up. I'm going to be deep diving Nintendo's manufacture of the next console in a forthcoming video, so I really encourage you to subscribe to keep up to date on all the latest Nintendo forecasts. Thank you so much for watching, liking and commenting, and have a terrific day. Thank you very much.